January 17th, 1942. Pacific Ocean, 200 miles southwest of Tokyo Bay. The water was black glass under a moonless sky. Beneath the surface, at periscope depth, the USS Gujin cut through the cold Pacific like a steel predator. Inside her pressure hull, 48 men breathed recycled air thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear. Commander Elton Grenfell pressed his eye to the periscope lens, watching the silhouette of a Japanese submarine materialize against the faint glow of distant stars. His hands were steady on the handles, but his heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment America's newest weapon would prove itself, or fail spectacularly in waters now controlled by the rising sun. The torpedo room was silent except for the whisper of men checking firing solutions one last time. The Gujin was a Gato-Class submarine, fresh from the Electric Boat Company's yards in Groton, Connecticut. She was 311 feet of welded steel, diesel engines, and American industrial ambition. Her torpedoes were loaded, her crew was green. And in the wardrooms of the Imperial Japanese Navy, officers who had studied at Harvard and Annapolis were already dismissing boats like her as relics of outdated thinking, too slow, too noisy, too predictable to threaten the empire that had just humiliated the United States at Pearl Harbor. They called the American submarine force a joke, a collection of obsolete boats crewed by men who didn't understand the warrior spirit, who lacked the discipline and sacrifice that defined the samurai tradition now reborn in Japan's modern navy. Japanese naval doctrine prioritized the decisive surface engagement, the climactic battle where battleships and carriers would determine the fate of nations. Submarines were auxiliary weapons, useful for reconnaissance, perhaps, but not the instruments of strategic victory. The Americans, they believed, would never have the stomach for the kind of war that was coming, a war of attrition, of patience, of silent killing in the dark. Commander Grenfell gave the order. 4 torpedoes leaped from the Gujin's bow tubes, their propellers churning white trails through the black water. 60 seconds later, the ocean erupted. The Japanese submarine I-173 broke apart in a column of fire and spray. Her hull cracked open like an eggshell, her crew of 90 men gone before they could scream. The Gujin dove deep, her hull groaning under the pressure, her crew listening to the sound of wreckage raining down through the water column above them. It was the first confirmed kill by a Gato-Class submarine. It would not be the last. In the winter of 1941, as Japanese carrier planes turned Pearl Harbor into an inferno, and Imperial Army divisions swept through Southeast Asia with terrifying speed, the United States Navy faced a crisis of confidence and capability. The Pacific Fleet's battleships lay broken in Hawaiian mud. The Philippines were falling. Wake Island would soon follow. America's carriers were outnumbered, her army unprepared, her industrial machine still gearing up for a war that had already begun. But beneath the waves, invisible to the newsreels and the headlines, a different kind of weapon was being forged. The Gato-Class submarine was not born from desperation. She was the product of years of careful design, the culmination of lessons learned from the S-boats and the earlier fleet submarines that had proven too small, too fragile, too limited in range for the vast distances of the Pacific. The Gato-Class was different. She displaced 1,500 tons submerged, could dive to 300 feet, and carried a crew of 60 to 80 men depending on configuration. Her 4 diesel engines could push her to 20 knots on the surface, and her electric motors gave her 9 knots submerged. Not fast by destroyer standards, but fast enough to position for attack, fast enough to escape if the geometry favored her. But it was her range that made her revolutionary. 11,000 nautical miles at 10 knots. She could patrol from Pearl Harbor to the Japanese home islands and back without refueling. She could lurk off enemy ports for weeks, waiting, watching, learning the patterns of merchant convoys and naval movements. She carried 24 torpedoes, a mix of Mark 14s and Mark 10s, weapons that, when they worked, could crack the keel of a tanker or punch through the armored belt of a cruiser. She was a commerce raider, a blockade enforcer, a strategic weapon designed not for the glorious surface engagement, but for the slow strangulation of an island empire that depended on imported oil, rubber, rice, and iron. The Japanese High Command did not see her coming. Their intelligence reports noted the construction of new American submarines, but the analysis was dismissive. Japanese submarines were designed for fleet actions, for scouting ahead of the battle line, for launching torpedo spreads at enemy capital ships during the decisive engagement. They were large, fast on the surface, and carried the Type 95 torpedo, a weapon with longer range and a bigger warhead than anything the Americans possessed. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized offensive operations in support of the combined fleet. The idea of using submarines primarily against merchant shipping was considered dishonorable, a waste of a weapon system that should be hunting warships. This was the fundamental miscalculation. Japan was an island nation with almost no domestic oil production, limited food supplies, and an industrial base that depended entirely on raw materials shipped from conquered territories in Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, and Manchuria. Every gallon of fuel oil that powered her battleships, every ton of rice that fed her soldiers, every ingot of steel that became an aircraft or a tank had to cross the ocean. Japan's merchant fleet in December 1941 numbered approximately 6 million tons of shipping. Her war planners estimated they needed at least 3 million tons operational at all times to sustain military operations and keep the home islands fed. They built their strategy on the assumption that the sea lanes would remain open, that convoys would move freely, that American submarines would be too few, too poorly led, and too ineffective to matter. They were catastrophically wrong. The first year of the war was a crucible of frustration and failure for the American submarine force. Boats like the Gudgeon, the Drum, the Silversides, and the Wahoo went out on patrol with high hopes and came back with empty torpedo racks and bitter stories. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary weapon of the submarine fleet, was a disaster. Its magnetic exploder detonated prematurely or not at all. Its contact exploder crumpled on impact instead of triggering. Its depth control sent torpedoes running too deep, passing harmlessly beneath enemy hulls. Skippers watched perfect firing solutions turn into nothing. No explosion, no hit, just the maddening sight of a torpedo wake passing under a target that sailed on, oblivious. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance refused to believe the reports. They insisted the torpedoes were fine, that the problem was poor seamanship, bad shooting, operator error. It took 2 years of combat data, of skippers risking courts-martial to deactivate the magnetic exploders, of field modifications and unauthorized tests, before the Bureau finally admitted the truth and fixed the weapons. 2 years. In that time, hundreds of Japanese ships that should have been sunk escaped. Thousands of tons of fuel and supplies reached their destinations. The war was prolonged by the incompetence of bureaucrats who valued their reputations over the lives of submariners and the success of the campaign. But even with defective torpedoes, the Gato-Class boats began to draw blood. In January 1942, the Gudgeon sank I-173. In February, the Drum torpedoed the seaplane tender Mizuho. In April, the Grenadier sank 3 cargo ships off Indochina. The kills were scattered, opportunistic, the work of individual skippers learning their trade under fire. There was no coordinated campaign yet, no systematic targeting of Japan's logistics network, but the foundation was being laid. Skippers were learning to trust their instincts over their torpedoes, to close to point-blank range where even a defective weapon might work, to take risks that would have horrified peacetime commanders. And the Japanese were beginning to notice. Not the High Command, not yet. They were focused on the Coral Sea, on Midway, on the great carrier battles that would decide the war in their favor. But the merchant captains noticed. The convoy commodores noticed. Ships began disappearing. A tanker here, a freighter there. Sometimes there was a distress call, a brief radio message about a submarine attack. Sometimes there was just silence, a ship that failed to arrive, a cargo that never reached port. The losses were manageable. absorbable within the vast scale of Japan's maritime empire, but they were growing. By the end of 1942, American submarines had sunk 180 Japanese merchant ships totaling roughly 700,000 tons. It was a fraction of Japan's total fleet, but it was 700,000 tons that would never carry oil from Borneo, rice from Indochina, or troops to New Guinea. And the pace was accelerating. New Gato-Class boats were sliding down the ways every month. Electric Boat, Mare Island, Portsmouth. The American shipyards were producing submarines faster than Japan could build escorts to protect her convoys. The industrial imbalance that would define the Pacific War was already visible to anyone willing to look at the numbers. The Japanese were not looking. They were winning. Their empire stretched from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. They had conquered more territory in 6 months than Germany had in 2 years. Their carriers had humiliated the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean. Their army was undefeated in the jungle. Why worry about a few lost freighters when the war was being won? June 1942. Midway. 4 Japanese carriers burning, their flight decks shattered, their aircraft and aircrew. The irreplaceable core of Japan's naval aviation, gone in a single morning. The strategic initiative in the Pacific shifted. Japan would never again have the strength to threaten Hawaii or the American West Coast. The war of conquest was over. The war of attrition had begun. And in a war of attrition, the Gato-Class submarine was the perfect weapon. Admiral Charles Lockwood took command of the Pacific Submarine Force in early 1943. He was a submariner's submariner, a man who had commanded boats in World War I, who understood the psychology of men who fought in steel tubes beneath the sea, who was willing to challenge the Bureau of Ordnance and demand fixes for the torpedo problems. Under his leadership, the submarine campaign transformed from a series of individual patrols into a coordinated offensive against Japan's maritime lifeline. Lockwood divided the Pacific into patrol zones. He established forward bases at Midway, Brisbane, and later Guam, cutting transit times and increasing time on station. He implemented wolfpack tactics, sending multiple boats to hunt the same convoy, coordinating attacks by radio, overwhelming the escorts. He pushed for better intelligence, working with code breakers to route submarines into the paths of high-value targets. And he fought for his skippers, relieving commanders who were too cautious, promoting aggressive captains like Dudley Morton, Richard O'Kane, and Eugene Fluckey. Men who understood that the only way to win was to take the fight to the enemy, to press attacks home regardless of the risk. The results were immediate and devastating. In 1943, American submarines sank 335 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 1.5 million tons. In 1944, the number climbed to 600 ships and nearly 3 million tons. The Gato-Class boats, now joined by their improved sisters, the Balao and Tench classes, were everywhere. Off Tokyo Bay, in the Luzon Strait, along the convoy routes from Singapore to Japan, in the shallow waters of the South China Sea, where Japanese captains thought they were safe. They hunted in packs. They laid mines. They rescued downed airmen. They landed commandos and coast watchers on enemy-held islands. But above all, they sank ships. Japanese merchant captains began to dread the night transits, the long stretches of open water where a periscope might be watching, where a spread of torpedoes might be racing toward their hull. Convoys grew larger, but escorts grew scarcer as destroyers were pulled away to fight the American advance across the Central Pacific. Routing became erratic as Japan tried to avoid known submarine patrol areas, adding days or weeks to voyages, burning precious fuel. Ships began hugging the coast, seeking the protection of shallow water and air cover. But the American submarines followed them even there, penetrating harbors and anchorages, sinking ships at their moorings. The Japanese tried to adapt. They built more escorts, small patrol craft and submarine chasers that were supposed to protect the convoys. But they were too few, too poorly equipped, and their crews were inadequately trained in anti-submarine warfare. Japan had never prioritized ASW doctrine the way Britain had been forced to in the Atlantic. They paid for that oversight in blood and oil. They tried to route convoys at night, but American radar, another technological advantage, allowed submarines to track targets in complete darkness. They tried to speed up transits, but faster ships burned more fuel, and fuel was exactly what Japan was running out of. By mid-1944, Japan's merchant fleet was in collapse. Of the 6 million tons available in December 1941, more than half was gone. New construction could not keep pace with losses. Shipyards that should have been building tankers and freighters were instead building warships for a navy that had no fuel to operate them. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies were still producing, but the oil could not reach Japan. Tankers were priority targets for American submarines, and they died in staggering numbers. In 1944 alone, submarines sank 1 million tons of tanker capacity. Japan's strategic oil reserves, the stockpiles that were supposed to sustain the war effort for years, were draining away. Refineries shut down for lack of crude. Aircraft were grounded. Warships stayed in port. Training for new pilots was cut back, producing inexperienced aviators who died in their first combat missions. The home islands began to starve. Rice imports from Korea and Indochina dropped by half. Fishing fleets could not operate without fuel. Civilians were put on rations that barely sustained life. Industrial production faltered as raw materials stopped arriving. The war economy, stretched thin by years of conflict, began to fracture. And still the submarines came, night after night, sinking ships faster than Japan could replace them. Inside the Gato-Class boats, the war was intimate and unforgiving. A submarine patrol lasted 60 to 90 days. 2 months of breathing the same air, eating the same food, sleeping in shifts in bunks stacked 3 high. The interior of a Gato-Class boat was a maze of machinery, pipes, valves, and electrical panels. Every square inch was functional. There was no wasted space, no comfort, no privacy. The crew lived among their weapons, slept next to their torpedoes, ate meals a few feet from the diesel engines that could kill them with carbon monoxide if a seal failed. The heat was oppressive in the tropics. Surface temperatures inside the boat could reach 120 degrees. Men worked stripped to the waist, their bodies slick with sweat, their skin breaking out in rashes from the humidity and the lack of fresh water for bathing. The air was foul, diesel exhaust, cooking smells, unwashed bodies, the chemical stink of the batteries that powered the electric motors. After a few weeks, no one noticed anymore. It was just the smell of the boat, the smell of war. The food started out good, fresh vegetables, fruit, meat. But within 2 weeks, the fresh stores were gone, and the crew was eating canned goods and dehydrated rations. Coffee was the universal currency, brewed strong and black, consumed in vast quantities to fight the fatigue that came from standing watch 4 hours on, 8 hours off, day after day. Sleep was fractured, interrupted by depth charge attacks, by the need to man battle stations, by the simple impossibility of rest when you knew that a single mistake, a single moment of inattention, could send the boat and everyone in her to the bottom. The psychological strain was immense. Submariners lived with the knowledge that if the boat was hit, if the hull was breached, there was no escape. A submarine that went down in deep water became a tomb. The crew would die in darkness, either instantly from the implosion of the pressure hull or slowly from suffocation as the air ran out. There were no rescue procedures, no way to reach a boat on the bottom. You went out on patrol knowing that if something went wrong, no one was coming to save you. And yet they went, patrol after patrol, mission after mission. The submarine service was all volunteer. No one was forced to serve on the boats. Men chose this duty, chose to climb down the hatch and seal themselves inside a steel cylinder and hunt the enemy in his own waters. They did it for many reasons: patriotism, adventure, the extra pay that submariners received, the pride of belonging to an elite force. But mostly they did it for each other, for the men they served with. for the unspoken bond that forms when your life depends on the competence and courage of the sailor standing next to you. The casualty rate was staggering. Of the 288 American submarines that served in World War II, 52 were lost. 18%. More than 3,600 men died, gone down with their boats, their bodies never recovered. It was the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military. And yet, there was never a shortage of volunteers. The waiting lists to join the submarine service grew longer as the war went on. Men wanted to be part of the silent service, wanted to prove themselves in the most demanding and dangerous duty the Navy offered. By early 1945, Japan's situation was hopeless. American submarines, now operating with near impunity, had reduced the merchant fleet to a shadow of its former strength. Less than 2 million tons of shipping remained operational, and much of that was trapped in ports, unable to move for lack of fuel or fear of submarine attack. The sea lanes between Japan and the occupied territories were graveyards. The Luzon Strait, the narrow passage between Taiwan and the Philippines, became known as Convoy College. American submarines gathered there in wolf packs, waiting for the convoys that had to pass through to reach Japan. Few made it. The oil stopped flowing. Japan's strategic reserves were exhausted. The combined fleet, once the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, was immobilized. The super battleship Yamato, the pride of the Imperial Navy, made her final sortie in April 1945 with only enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa. She never arrived, sunk by American carrier aircraft before she could reach the battle zone. Her escorts limped back to port on fumes. The home islands were isolated: Korea, Manchuria, China. All the conquered territories that were supposed to feed the empire were cut off. Supplies could not move. Troops could not be reinforced or evacuated. Entire armies were stranded, left to wither on distant islands while Japan herself faced invasion. The strategic concept that had driven Japan to war, the creation of a self-sufficient Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, had been strangled by 77 Gato-Class submarines and their sisters. 77 boats, not hundreds, not thousands. 77 Gato-Class submarines, supported by earlier S-boats and later Balao and Tench-class boats, had sunk 30% of Japan's merchant fleet and more than 200 warships, including a battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. They had done what the battleships and carriers could not do alone. They had severed the arteries that kept the Japanese war machine alive. They had turned Japan's geography, her dependence on the sea, into a fatal vulnerability. The Japanese commanders who had mocked the American submarine force in 1941, who had dismissed the Gato-Class as too slow and too predictable, were silent now. Many were dead, gone down with their ships. Others were ashore, watching the empire collapse, unable to move supplies or reinforcements, unable to do anything but wait for the end. The warrior spirit, the samurai code, the belief in decisive battle and glorious victory. None of it mattered when the oil tanks were empty and the rice warehouses were bare. There was a story that circulated among Japanese prisoners of war in the final months of the conflict. A story that captured the psychological impact of the submarine campaign more powerfully than any statistic. It concerned a Japanese merchant captain who had survived 3 torpedo attacks, whose ship had been hit but not sunk, who had limped into port with his cargo intact. He was interviewed by naval intelligence officers who wanted to understand how the Americans were operating, what tactics they were using, how the convoys might be better protected. The captain told them about the submarines, about the periscopes that appeared without warning, about the torpedo wakes cutting through the water, about the explosions that tore ships apart. But what haunted him, what he could not stop talking about, was something else. After the 3rd attack, as his damaged ship struggled toward port, he had seen debris floating in the water, wreckage from another merchant vessel that had been sunk days earlier. Among the debris were crates, broken open, their contents spilled into the sea. American supplies, he realized. goods that had been captured from a sunken American transport. He described what he saw. Canned food, so much canned food that it formed a slick on the water. Chocolate bars in waxed paper wrappers, cigarettes in sealed tins, coffee, sugar, powdered milk, medical supplies, clothing, boots, all of it floating in the ocean, discarded, wasted, lost. And the captain said to the intelligence officers, "How can we defeat an enemy who has so much that they can afford to lose it? We are starving, and they throw food into the sea." It was not quite accurate. The supplies were not thrown away. They were lost in combat. But the perception was what mattered. The abundance of American industry, the sheer material wealth that allowed the United States to build submarines and torpedoes and supply ships faster than they could be sunk, was incomprehensible to Japanese officers who were rationing rice and counting bullets. The Gato-Class submarine became a symbol of that abundance, a weapon that embodied American industrial power and strategic patience. Each boat represented thousands of tons of steel, miles of electrical wiring, precision machinery, advanced optics, radar, sonar, radio equipment. Each torpedo cost thousands of dollars and contained hundreds of pounds of high explosive. Each patrol consumed thousands of gallons of diesel fuel, and America built them by the dozen, sent them out month after month, replaced losses without hesitation, improved designs, trained new crews, sustained a campaign that lasted 4 years and covered millions of square miles of ocean. Japan could not match it. Japan's industrial base was a fraction of America's. Her shipyards were building submarines too, but they were building the wrong submarines. Large fleet boats designed for offensive operations against warships, not commerce raiders optimized for long patrols and torpedo attacks on merchants. Japanese submarines sank a few American ships, but they never threatened the supply lines that sustained the American advance across the Pacific. They could not. They were outnumbered, outproduced, and outfought by an enemy who understood that modern war was as much about logistics and industrial capacity as it was about courage and tactics. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, her merchant fleet was effectively extinct. Of the 6 million tons that had existed in December 1941, less than 1.5 million tons remained afloat, and much of that was damaged beyond economical repair. American submarines had accounted for 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping losses, more than 3,000 ships totaling nearly 5 million tons. They had also sunk more than 200 warships, crippling the Imperial Navy's ability to operate and forcing Japan to divert destroyers and escorts from offensive operations to the futile task of protecting convoys. The cost to the submarine force was heavy but proportionate. 52 boats lost, 3,600 men dead. But those 52 boats and 3,600 men had achieved a strategic impact far beyond their numbers. They had isolated Japan, starved her industry, grounded her air force, immobilized her navy. They had made the invasion of the home islands, an operation that would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, unnecessary by demonstrating that Japan could not sustain the war, even if she fought to the last man. The Gato-Class submarine, the weapon that Japanese commanders had mocked, had proven to be one of the most effective instruments of naval warfare ever devised. She was not glamorous. She did not fight in the great carrier battles that dominated the headlines. She did not participate in the amphibious assaults that captured islands and advanced the front line. But she did something more important. She severed the connections that held the Japanese Empire together. She turned the Pacific Ocean from Japan's defensive moat into a killing ground where every ship, every convoy, every ton of cargo was at risk. There is a memorial in Pearl Harbor, not far from the sunken battleship Arizona, where the names of the 52 lost submarines are inscribed on marble tablets. Tourists visit the Arizona by the thousands, paying tribute to the men who died on December 7, 1941. Few visit the submarine memorial. It is quieter, less dramatic, easier to overlook. But the submariners would not have minded. They were the silent service after all. They did their work in darkness and secrecy, beneath the waves, far from the cameras and the reporters. They did not seek glory. They sought results. And they achieved them with a thoroughness and efficiency that changed the course of the war. The Gato-Class submarine was a weapon born from American industrial might and strategic vision. She was the product of a nation that understood that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in factories, shipyards, and supply depots. She was crewed by men who volunteered for the most dangerous duty their country could offer, who lived in steel tubes for months at a time, who faced death every time they dove, and who did it without complaint or hesitation because they believed in the cause they served. Japan's commanders mocked the Gato-Class submarine because they did not understand the kind of war they were fighting. They believed in decisive battles, in the clash of fleets, in the warrior spirit that would overcome material disadvantage. They were wrong. The Pacific War was not won by spirit or courage. Both sides had those in abundance. It was won by oil and steel, by logistics and production, by the patient, relentless application of industrial power to strategic objectives. 77 Gato-Class submarines sank 30% of Japan's merchant fleet. They did it quietly, methodically, without fanfare. They did it in the dark waters off enemy coasts, in the narrow straits where convoys had to pass, in the open ocean where there was nowhere to hide. They did it with defective torpedoes and inadequate intelligence, and the constant threat of depth charges and aircraft. They did it because they were Americans, and Americans build things that work, and when they don't work, Americans fix them and keep going. The Japanese commanders learned too late what the Gato-Class submarine represented. She was not just a weapon. She was a promise that America would fight with every resource at her disposal, that she would innovate and adapt and persist, that she would turn her industrial strength into military power and apply it without mercy until the enemy was defeated. It was a promise written in steel and diesel fuel and torpedo wakes. It was a promise kept by 3,600 men who never came home, and by the thousands more who did, who climbed out of their boats at war's end and walked back into the sunlight, their duty done, their victory complete. In the end, the Gato-Class submarine did not just sink ships, she sank an empire. And she did it so quietly that even now, 80 years later, most people have never heard her name.